In 1941, as the Japanese began to expand, they set their sights on Guam and conducted an amphibious landing. After overrunning the capital city, Agana, the Japanese then pushed toward the Navy base at Apra Harbor. They ultimately captured it. And for the next 32 months, the Japanese occupied Guam. But then, during the summer of 1944, U.S. forces came back. In a battle that starts on July 21st and lasts all the way to August 10th, 1944, the United States, after carrying out an opposed amphibious landing operation, pushes Japanese defending forces on the island all the way to the north, overrunning them and destroying organized Japanese resistance. On W Day, Friday, July 21st, 1944, the 3rd Marine Division carried out an opposed amphibious landing operation here on Assen Beach. The 9th Marine Regiment landed on the far right on Blue Beach, closest to Assen Point. The 21st Marine Regiment landed in the center on Green Beach, and the 3rd Marine Regiment landed on 2 beaches, Red 1 and Red 2. The leading elements of these regiments were to capture the high ground immediately inland from the beach and defend it until the division was ready to expand the beachhead. Once this beach was secure, the 3rd Marine Division pushed east and then to the southeast.
The Marianas was really the beginning of the Japanese use of caves. With Guam, the Japanese here had the ability to dig in caves.
In addition to the challenges thrown up by the enemy as American forces fought to liberate Guam, they also had to contend with the environment, and the environment at times was quite harsh. Guam has terrain features that range from lowland areas, waterfalls, deep ravines, all the way up to mountains on the island. And so the terrain features on Guam presented obstacles that it was difficult for our maneuver battalions to get up and over. The enemy could also make extensive use of the jungle environment to camouflage fighting positions and to interfere with the advance of assaulting troops. To make matters even worse, it's a tropical environment, so the heat and the humidity are a major problem, particularly during the summer months, which is when the battle was fought. The landings on the 2,500-yard wide beachhead at Assen initially stalled under heavy fire from the front and from concealed Japanese positions along the ridgeline of Assen Point. But then tanks were landed 40 minutes after the first wave came ashore, and after that, the assault companies began to move inland and advance off of the beach.
Luther Skaggs was born in Kentucky and joined the United States Marine Corps in October of 1942. But on July 21st, 1944, he found himself with the United States Marine Corps invasion force on the island of Guam. Now, the landings at Guam did not go as well as anybody had planned or predicted. The fight was right from the lip of the landing craft that he disembarked from all the way up the beach. In fact, Skaggs' section leader was killed immediately as soon as the fight opened up, and he assumed the role, being a private first class, of being the squad leader of his outfit. He took the men 200 yards inside the beach landing area, where they found fortifiable positions and set up a defensive perimeter against the onslaught of the Japanese defenders of the island of Guam. This fight lasted a solid 8 hours, from the moment they landed until dawn the next day. Skaggs was sometimes alone in his foxhole when a Japanese grenade came in during one of the night attacks. The grenade went off and literally tore Skaggs' leg to mincemeat. He had to tie a tourniquet to his leg just to keep from bleeding out immediately. That wasn't the end of the fight for Skaggs. He kept up a ferocious fire using hand grenades and gunfire against the Japanese for a solid 8 hours. He dragged himself back to the main American lines behind him and continued to fight, refusing all efforts to get him under medical care immediately. It wasn't until the Japanese were subdued late the next day that he would allow anybody to tend his wounds and look after him. As a result of the fight of the 21st and 22nd of July, 1944, Private Skaggs lost his leg in that action. But he won the admiration of his fellow platoon mates that used to call him Little Tough Guy, right up until the point where Harry S. Truman pinned the Medal of Honor on him at a White House ceremony in Washington, D.C.
Want to know what's happening at American Rifleman? Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. We'll be right back.
The Pacific War Museum here on Guam was opened by the late John Gerber, who served in the Marine Corps during the war in Vietnam. After he got out of the Corps in 1975, Gerber moved back to Guam, and during that time he began collecting World War II artifacts. His collection grew and grew through the 80s and 90s to the point that he opened this museum to put everything on exhibit. And what's so interesting about many of the artifacts that are on display here is that they're actually battlefield pickups. In other words, they're relics of the fighting that took place here during the Second World War. So on a visit, you can see bayonets, rifles, pistols, machine guns that were used by Japanese and American troops during the summer of 1944 during the Battle of Guam.
The fighting in the Pacific was summed up by a Marine raider as the right kind of war. And it wasn't the right kind of war because it was a clean war. There's no such thing as that. But once everybody knew the rules, once everyone understood that with the Japanese, no quarter would be asked and none given, they knew exactly what kind of war they would be fighting.
Guam earned 4 Marines Medals of Honor, which is an exceedingly high percentage rate for those engaged. But as the inscription in gold leaf is on the memorial in Arlington, uncommon valor was a common virtue.
During the war, several Marines were awarded the Medal of Honor for their use of the BAR. On Guam, Frank Whittick, a young Marine BARman, was supporting the move 9th Marines up at the very end of the campaign, pushing the Japanese to the north end of the island. There was a sudden attack, which included even 2 Japanese tanks coming through, and he stepped up with his BAR and killed 8 or 9 Japanese, allowing his unit to fall back. He fell back, then covering them along the way, and then went forward again with his BAR and cleaned out Japanese machine gun nests until he was himself killed. He was presented posthumously with a Medal of Honor.
The fighting was ferocious on Guam. It was not that the fighting isn't ferocious wherever fighting is going on, but this was on a huge scale. We had nearly 30,000 men deployed, and the Japanese had 18,000. They lost all of them. It was nearly 100% casualty rate with the Japanese on Guam. They put up a tenacious fight that lasted almost 3 weeks. In fact, there were 5 U.S. Marines were ambushed and killed in December of that year by Japanese holdouts.
54-year-old Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata took command of the Japanese 31st Division here on Guam in March of 1944. But during the closing days of the battle that was fought here, he commanded all Japanese forces on the island. By August 10th, though, the Japanese had been driven to the northern end of the island. Obata's headquarters, which was located right here, was under constant fire from the air, from the ground, and from the sea. And organized resistance was no longer possible. And so on the morning of August 11th, Obata transmitted a farewell message to the emperor saying, "I shall be the bulwark of the Pacific Ocean." And then minutes later, he carried out the ritual of seppuku, killing himself. Considering that, you have to recognize that the Battle of Guam reached its inevitable conclusion here on the morning of August 11th, 1944. By the end of the Battle of Guam, the Japanese island garrison of over 18,000 has been completely destroyed. Over 3,000 Americans are killed during this battle, but the island was liberated. By the time that it ended, it was known to the American military that not every Japanese soldier on the island had been killed or captured. In other words, it was already recognized that Japanese were hiding in the jungle. And so the American military couldn't simply just pack up after the battle and leave. In the 4th Marine Division, they helped to put together and train a force of the people who are native to the island of Guam, the Chamorro. This constabulary force had the responsibility of providing some security for the Japanese that were known to still be out there hiding in the jungle. And those people had to be armed. We call them now the Guam Garans. And the Guam Garans equipped the constabulary force on Guam. In the years immediately after the war, they were then put away in an armory on the island. They remained there for decades and decades and decades. And then in 1996, a batch of 31 M1 30 caliber service rifles returned to the United States. And they went to private owners. We call them the Guam Garans. And they're a rare breed among M1 service rifles. And that's because of the fact that they have provenance that directly links them to an identified World War II battle, because we know that U.S. Marines carried them to Guam during the summer of '44. We know that the Marines then ultimately turned those rifles over to the Chamorro Island Constabulary Force that was created at the end of the battle. And we know that those rifles remained on Guam for another 50 years before ultimately being brought back to the United States. And so the Guam Garans represent something that is almost impossible to come by. That is, original as-built M1 service rifles with a direct provenance linking them to an identified World War II battle.